Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going to be looking at the Republican tax cut battle of 2025. And wow, you guys sent in a bunch of material for this one. Articles, op-eds, all kinds of stuff. So let's dive right in. We're in February 2025. Trump is in his second term. The Republicans, they've got the House, they've got the Senate. Seems like a slam dunk for their agenda, right?
Well, you would think so.
But not quite.
Not exactly, no. Turns out, even with all that power, they're having a really tough time passing these massive tax cuts. What's really interesting here is that it's not just about cutting taxes, it's about how to pay for them. And with the debt ceiling coming up and government funding set to expire in March, things are going to get very real very quickly.
Yeah. Okay, so paint a picture for us. What exactly are these House Republicans proposing?
So they're aiming for about a little over, actually, $4.5 trillion in tax cuts over the next decade.
Okay.
To give you some context, that's larger than the entire economies of Germany or Japan.
Wow, okay, those are some serious numbers. But how do they plan to make up for all of that lost revenue? I mean, $4.5 trillion is a lot of money.
It is. Well, their plan includes a $4 trillion increase to the debt ceiling.
Okay.
That would push the country's total liabilities over $40 trillion.
Okay, so for those of us who maybe need a little bit of a refresher, what exactly does raising the debt ceiling mean?
Sure. So essentially, it allows the government to borrow more money to pay its bills.
Okay.
The debt ceiling has been raised or suspended numerous times throughout history. It's pretty common, although it often leads to partisan battles.
Right.
But in this case, raising it by $4 trillion, that could be a tough pill to swallow, especially for those Republicans who campaigned on, being fiscally responsible.
Right, okay. So more debt. What else is in this plan?
Right. So to try and balance things out, they're proposing $2 trillion in cuts to mandatory spending programs.
Over 10 years?
Yeah, over the next 10 years.
Okay, hold on a sec. $2 trillion in cuts. Where are those cuts going to come from? I mean, that's a lot.
It is, and the specifics are pretty vague at this point, but it's likely to target those big-ticket items that we always hear about: Medicaid, Social Security, Medicare.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah, I mean, those are programs that millions of Americans rely on. And I could see why this is causing some friction within the Republican Party itself, right? I mean, it seems like they're kind of split into different camps on this.
Oh, absolutely. You've got lawmakers from high-tax states, like New York and California, who are pushing for these bigger SALT deductions.
SALT.
That stands for state and local taxes.
Right, okay.
And for their constituents, these deductions, they're crucial because they can offset the high state and local taxes that they pay.
I see, but wouldn't larger deductions just blow an even bigger hole in the budget?
Exactly, and that's where you have these hardline conservatives coming in. They're all about fiscal responsibility, and they are demanding some deep spending cuts to compensate for these tax cuts. And they're even considering eliminating taxes on things like, tips and Social Security benefits, overtime pay. I mean, some pretty big things.
Wait, but wouldn't eliminating those taxes actually increase the debt? I mean, that seems kind of counterintuitive for a group that's all about fiscal conservatism.
It is a bit ironic, isn't it? The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, they estimate that some of these proposals, if enacted, could add trillions to the national debt. So yeah, it really highlights the tension between these different factions and their priorities.
Right. And then, so you have these two groups, and then in the middle you have the centrists who are kind of, they're trying to please everybody. And it's kind of like being asked to make a 5-course meal with only like a can of beans and some scale bread.
Right.
It's like, how are you going to pull this off?
It puts Speaker Mike Johnson in a really difficult position. I mean, he's trying to project confidence, emphasizing this, commitment to the president's entire agenda.
Right.
But, behind the scenes, I imagine he's sweating bullets a little bit. He's already had to rely on Democratic votes in the past, and this tax issue is even more divisive within his own party.
Yeah, that's a tough balancing act, for sure. So what's his strategy? I mean, is he trying to appease the hardliners, maybe push through these deep spending cuts? Or is he going to try to find some kind of middle ground, some compromise?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. But one thing that he seems to be banking on is this idea that, the tax cuts, they're going to generate massive economic growth and kind of pay for themselves. They're talking about energy deregulation, reciprocal trade, all of these additional revenue sources. It will all balance out in the end. That's the idea.
Energy deregulation and reciprocal trade? Those sound like some pretty technical terms. Can you break those down for us a little bit?
Sure. So energy deregulation, it basically means reducing government regulations on the energy industry.
Okay.
And the idea is that this will lead to more energy production, which could lower prices and ultimately stimulate economic growth.
Okay.
reciprocal trade that involves agreements between countries to reduce or eliminate trade barriers, things like tariffs.
Right.
And the hope there is that this will boost exports and imports and lead to, again, increased economic activity, which in turn would generate more tax revenue.
So they're betting on this trickle-down effect, basically, hoping that these cuts will stimulate enough economic growth to offset the initial losses.
Yeah, exactly. But it is a gamble. And remember, they insisted the 2017 tax cuts wouldn't impact the deficit, but independent analogies actually showed that those cuts added trillions to the debt.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. So is this whole growth argument, I mean, is it just wishful thinking?
It's definitely contentious. There's a whole debate amongst economists about the effectiveness of tax cuts to stimulate economic growth. Some argue that it mostly just benefits wealthy individuals and corporations, while others believe it can have a positive impact on the economy overall.
Okay, so we've thrown a lot of information out there, but for our listener, I mean, what does all this mean? Why should they care about all of this political tug-of-war?
Because the outcome of this is going to have ripple effects throughout the entire economy.
Right.
We're not talking about abstract numbers here. This will impact everyone's lives.
Yeah, and they don't have a lot of time to figure this out. Government funding expires March 14th. Debt ceiling needs to be raised by summer. Democrats are already threatening to block that stopgap funding because of their opposition to some of Trump's policies. This is about to get very real.
It is. And, to make things even more interesting, the Senate, it seems to be taking a different approach. Instead of trying to, tackle this tax issue head on all at once, they're focusing on other things first. Border security, military spending, energy.
Almost like they're trying to, I don't know, avoid the big elephant in the room, right?
Maybe.
Is this a sign of some division within the Republican Party, or are they just strategically trying to manage all these different internal pressures?
It could be both. The Senate's approach allows them to address some of these key issues without getting bogged down in the tax debate. But it also suggests that maybe there isn't a clear consensus within the Republican ranks about how to move forward with this tax plan.
Okay, so we've got a potential government shutdown. We've got a massive tax cut proposal that could explode the national debt. We've got a divided Republican Party trying to figure out how to make it all work. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the next part of this deep dive. We're going to look at Speaker Johnson's leadership style, the potential scenarios that could unfold, and what this all means for, the average American.
All right. Stay tuned, folks, because things are about to get really interesting. Okay, so we've kind of laid out the battlefield here. Huge tax cuts being proposed, deep divisions within the Republican Party, deadlines just around the corner. Let's maybe zoom in on Speaker Johnson for a second. I mean, he's really in the hot seat, isn't he?
Oh, he is. Imagine trying to, herd cats. But the cats are all wearing different colored jerseys, and each one represents a different faction with their own, demands and agendas. That's kind of what Johnson's dealing with here.
Yeah. He seems to be projecting confidence publicly, but I imagine behind closed doors, it's a very different story. What kind of pressure do you think he's facing from these different factions?
Well, you've got the hardliners, right? They're breathing down his neck, demanding those deep spending cuts. They see this as a make-or-break moment for fiscal responsibility. And then on the other side, you have those representatives from those high-tax states who are adamant about keeping those SALT deductions. They argue that, these deductions are really important for their constituents and that any losses in revenue will be made up for by the overall economic benefits of the tax cuts.
Right, and then there's that ticking clock. I mean, government funding, it runs out March 14th. How do you think that's impacting the negotiations, having that deadline right there?
Oh, it's huge. It's a major factor. The closer we get to that deadline, the more pressure there is to reach some sort of agreement. But it also creates an opportunity for brinksmanship, right? Each faction could kind of dig in their heels and hope that the other side blinks first to try and avoid a shutdown.
Yeah, a shutdown would be a political nightmare, especially with those 2026 midterms coming up. How much do you think Republicans are weighing those political risks against their desire to push through these tax cuts?
Well, it's a high-stakes gamble. They know that if they are seen as the ones who caused a shutdown, it could really backfire on them. But they also campaigned on these tax cuts, and their base is expecting them to deliver. So it's really, they're between a rock and a hard place.
Right. And then we've got the Democrats, who are kind of watching all this unfold, I'd say with some glee, just waiting to pounce on any misstep the Republicans make. How much leverage do the Democrats have in this situation?
They have a lot, especially in the Senate, where they can filibuster any legislation that they don't like. And they've already signaled their willingness to block that stopgap funding, which means if Republicans want to avoid a shutdown, they're likely going to have to make some concessions.
Okay. So taking all that into account, what are some potential outcomes here? What are the most likely scenarios that we could see unfold?
Okay, so one possibility is that Republicans manage to kind of put aside their differences, present a united front, and push through a version of the tax plan that satisfies enough members to get it passed. But, I mean, this would require a lot of compromise, particularly on those contentious issues like the SALT deductions and spending cuts.
Okay, and what about a compromise with the Democrats? Is there any room for a bipartisan agreement on this?
You know, it's unlikely. The Democrats have said they oppose the sale of the tax cuts and what it'll do to the deficit, and they're concerned that the cuts would disproportionately benefit the wealthy and corporations. They're not really seeing a lot there for the working class.
Okay, so a grand bargain is probably off the table. What does the worst-case scenario look like?
Well, I mean, a worst-case scenario is that negotiations completely break down and we end up with a government shutdown. And, I mean, that would have pretty significant economic consequences, disrupted services, erosion of public confidence. And politically, it would be really bad for the Republicans. It could cost them control of Congress in the 26 midterms.
Yeah, there are a lot of potential pitfalls here. What do you think is Speaker Johnson's strategy right now? Is he trying to push for some sort of grand compromise, or is he maybe more inclined to play hardball and try and force the Republican plan through?
It's tough to say for sure, but based on his public statements, he seems to be trying to project an image of strength, of unity. He's talking about how important it is to deliver on the president's agenda. He keeps bringing up those potential economic benefits from these tax cuts. But I think behind the scenes, he's got to be doing some pretty serious negotiating, trying to find some way to move forward that doesn't end in a complete meltdown.
Right, he's walking a tightrope. He's got to try and appease all these different factions within his own party while also navigating, the realities of a divided Congress. And he's got this deadline looming over him. What are some of the key factors that you think will determine whether he succeeds or fails?
Well, I think one key factor is going to be his ability to actually unify that Republican caucus. Can he get the hardliners who want those deep spending cuts and the moderates who are more worried about the impact on their constituents? Can he get them on the same page? And I think another key factor is going to be how willing he is to negotiate with Democrats. Will he make some concessions to avoid a shutdown? Or is he determined to just push through that Republican plan no matter what?
Right, and let's not forget public opinion. How much pressure do you think Republicans are feeling from their base to deliver on these tax cuts?
That's a big one. They know that their base expects them to follow through on their campaign promises, but they also have to be careful not to alienate those more moderate voters who might be concerned about the size of these cuts and the impact on the deficit.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to sell this whole thing as kind of a win-win, tax cuts, economic growth, everyone's happy. But as we've seen with the 2017 tax cuts, it didn't quite play out that way. How do you think the public is responding to these new proposals?
Well, I think there's definitely some skepticism out there. A lot of people remember what happened with the 2017 tax cuts, and they're worried that these new proposals will mostly just benefit the wealthy and corporations while doing very little to help the middle class.
So it seems like Speaker Johnson has his work cut out for him. He's got to manage all of this internal division, navigate the realities of the divided Congress, and try and convince the public that these cuts are in their best interest.
It's a tall order. But that's politics, right? It's often messy, unpredictable, and full of these really tough choices.
Yeah, and in this case, the stakes are incredibly not. And the decisions that are made in the next few weeks and months, they're going to have a huge impact on the economy, on the national debt, on the whole political landscape.
Yeah, it's a real turning point. It'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
All right, so we've got ourselves a real political thriller here. High-stakes negotiations, deadlines looming, and a whole lot of uncertainty about what happens next. I feel like we're kind of on the edge of our seats watching all of this play out.
Yeah, it's a pivotal moment for sure. Remember at the start we were talking about the Republicans being in this, golden age? Well, this whole tax battle could really make or break that whole narrative.
It seems like they're walking a tightrope. They need to keep their base happy, the folks who are really expecting those tax cuts. But they also can't just completely ignore moderate voters, especially with the midterms coming up.
Right, and then there are the economic implications of all of this. We're talking about potentially trillions of dollars added to the national debt. We're talking about cuts to these really important social programs. We're talking about the risk of a government shutdown. I mean, these are things that affect everyone, not just the folks in Washington making the decisions.
Right. This isn't just some political game, right? These decisions have real-world consequences for people's lives and their livelihoods.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for everyone to be informed about what's going on. Understand the arguments, follow the developments, make your voice heard.
So let's maybe shift gears a little bit and look at how the Senate is approaching all of this. They seem to be taking a more cautious, kind of piecemeal approach to this whole thing, right?
Yeah, they are. While the House is going all in, trying to do this big tax overhaul all at once, The Senate's focusing on other priorities first, border security, military spending, energy. It's a different strategy for sure, maybe a way to try and avoid some of that internal conflict that we're seeing over in the House.
Makes you wonder if they're trying to kind of quietly distance themselves from the House. Like, hey, if this all blows up, don't blame us.
It's possible, but it could also just be strategic, right? By focusing on areas where there's maybe more bipartisan support, they can rack up some wins, build some momentum before having to tackle that more contentious issue of taxes.
Yeah, okay, so we've got these two different approaches playing out. The House is going all in on these massive tax cuts. The Senate's taking a more cautious approach, kind of wait and see. What do you think is the more likely outcome here?
Well, if I had a crystal ball, I'd be a very rich man. Honestly, it's too early to tell. There are just so many factors at play, and things can change so quickly. A lot depends on Speaker Johnson's leadership, the dynamics within the Republican Party, and how willing both parties are to compromise.
So we're left with more questions than answers, I guess. But hey, that's kind of the nature of these deep dives, right? We take a complex issue, we break it down, look at all the different perspectives, and hopefully we come away with a better understanding of what's at stake.
Right. And sometimes the most important takeaway is that there are no easy answers. This isn't a simple case of right versus wrong. There are valid arguments to be made on both sides.
And ultimately, it's up to each individual to figure out where they stand on all of this. What do you think, listener? Do you think these tax cuts are the right way to go? Are you concerned about what it'll do to the national debt, to those in social programs?
Well, we've given you the information, different perspectives, some possible outcomes. Now it's up to you to connect the dots, weigh the evidence, and form your own informed opinion.
Because these aren't just political debates. These are decisions that have real-world consequences that affect all of us. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking questions. That's how we make sure our voices are heard and that the decisions made in Washington actually reflect what we, the people they're supposed to represent, actually care about.
Very well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another, hopefully just as fascinating, look at the issues that shape our world.
See you next time.